The following video is from October 2025 and today. Viewer discretion is advised.
Before we start the video, I wanted to show you the quote.
Phantasm. The delusion of a disordered mind. A phantom. A spirit. A ghost.
This quote came from the movie series Phantasm, directed by Don Costarelli. The reasons I bring this quote up today is to deliver a question. What happens when you take two medias, such as the Alien and Resident Evil, which is the survival horror, and what you get is Martian Gothic? Before I get into Martian Gothic and the company that made the game, I wanted to take you back to the 90s. As a kid who was born from the mid-90s while growing up in the year 2000s, I didn't think much about the video game bit wars that was going on in the 90s, as well as the video game crash of 1983. Back then, I was accustomed to the N64, such as like South Park 64, and yes, I'm highly aware of its nature. Super Smash Bros., which I think I remember playing this at a birthday party, and the OG classic GoldenEye 64. During the year 2000s, a company named Creative Realities made Martian Gothic. Unfortunately, however, the company went out of business after the release of Martian Gothic. I tried getting information about the company from a website, but it seems like their website is no longer in service because they're using a dead program, Adobe Flash. That is until I found an article from Moby Games. According to the article, they are a British developer founded in the mid-1980s by Neil Dowell and David Dew. They made a few computer games back in the mid-1980s up until the early 1990s, until they made a game they're best known for, Dreamweb. Dreamweb is a point-and-click adventure that came out in 1994, and it was banned from Australia for not safe for work. I've heard and seen the gameplay some time ago, but I have no idea that Creative Reality were the ones that made this game, with one writer that is actually behind it, Stephen Marley. All I know about Mr. Stephen Marley is that he's a British author and a video game designer, best known for the Chia Black Dragon series. And yes, you can make a Chia pet joke here. He took up writing full-time in 1985 and had 7 novels published, and he pursued on the parallel career in video games, working mainly with Creative Reality software, and was the designer for Martian Gothic. But he's also involved with the projects of Dreamweb, which it says so right here. With this plenty of information in mind, let's talk about Martian Gothic.
We've explained about Martian Gothic in the Part 2 documentary review looking over the RE clones that tried to innovate then Resident Evil, but failed or succeeded. The overall story, as I was debriefing, is the same as Resident Evil, showing the reasons to investigate at the start of the game, trapped inside an abandoned place upon their arrival after it got dangerous outside, exploring and finding out what happened inside the place and finding their escape, and a self-destruct timer at the end.
It's as if Stephen Marley had copy-pasted the entire story, but the only difference is that this is on Mars and not on Earth. The overall presentation is both a mixture of science fiction and horror, which kinda reminds me of John Carpenter's Ghosts of Mars. Unfortunately, however, this game came out just a year before Ghost of Mars came out in 2001. Yet the overall gameplay is not as smooth as Resident Evil, which I find it extremely odd in this gameplay choice. The way how the characters run, they have like the stiff urgency to use the toilet. Compared to Resident Evil again, they have a much better run cycle that shows realistically going from point A to point B.
Let's not forget that the characters didn't react at all throughout the station when enemies got up. They didn't seem to be bothered by them getting up and attack 90% of the gameplay.
There's something in Resoc antechamber. It's big, it's mean, and you wouldn't want to share a beer with it, know what I'm saying?
It's as if the voice actors and actresses didn't even bother voice acting throughout the majority of this entire game. Funny thing is that Stephen Marley was in charge of the directory for the voice acting as well as the writing for this game while he was developing it. Martian Gothic for the PlayStation isn't that bad in comparison to the PC version. From what I've heard, that the PC version has a ton of bugs and glitches that would cause the game to break and not to mention, of course, cause it to game lock up. Yet they're the same game, but I think that the PC version hasn't been playtested before it got shipped. On the contrary, there is some fan-made patches that were made for the game itself in order to bypass the glitch and the game lockup, yet it's not even as efficient enough. It's as if this game is too advanced in order to not be repaired. If anybody else wants to see the scramble mess that is the PC version, I highly recommend watching Ross's Game Dungeon on Martian Gothic. He went through a whole lot of hoops just to actually fix the game with patch notes in order to play Martian Gothic, but the problem thing is that it still lingers with this same problem. The link is in the description down below.
Let's talk about the story of Martian Gothic. At the opening intro, we see a ship that is about to crash land on Mars with an AI talking in the background of their rival, but not before spoiling the ending, only two will leave.
3 are coming. Only 2 will leave. The bad dreams will always be with us. And now and again, dreams come true.
Why does it sound familiar? Like I've seen it before, where there's an AI that talks about the main protagonist that showed up at the wrong place at the wrong time before submerging them into the horrifying horrors that they were about to witness. I've seen it before, but where?
New Atlanta, Sector 11, Building 71G. 7 April 2072. 11:13 p.m. Hacker begins unauthorized entry into the Tri-Optimum corporate network. 1:26 a.m. Hacker attempts to access protected files concerning Space Station Citadel.
That's right, System Shock.
Look at you, Hacker. A pathetic creature of meat and bone.
System Shock is a first-person shooter cyberpunk survival horror where you play as the hacker who woke up from a 6-month healing coma and Citadel Station is overrun by cyborgs, mutants, and Servant Series robots. The story goes is that the unnamed hacker tried to hack into the Tri-Optimum security regarding to Citadel Station's cybernetic implants, military-grade interface. Unfortunately, he was caught by Tri-Optimum security and was brought to Citadel Station, awaiting for trial. Unfortunately, Edward Diego proposed with 2 options, either serve out his sentences or work for him in return for the military-grade interface. Leaving with no options, he worked for Edward Diego to remove ethical restraints regarding to Shodance's program AI. The AI narrator that tells the story of the hacker who came into Citadel Station in the first place is revealed to be Shodan. She became self-aware after the ethical restraints were removed, after the hacker's work was done. Unbeknownst to him, the nightmare had just begun. Once he already done that, he already got his military-grade interface in return. The hacker was put in a 6-month healing coma, and 6 months later, all hell had broken loose in Citadel Station. Very recently, I actually played the remake version of System Shock, and it's an excellent recreation of the original of Citadel Station. And the graphics are just magnificent, which I gotta have to give applause to Night Dive Studio for the excellent work. If Night Dive Studio approaches me with this promotion, I would promote this immediate. With that bit of nostalgia, let us focus on Stephen Marley's Martian Gothic.
We are given no clues as to why they arrived at the Mars Vita base in context. other than the communications to the base were out in 10 months. Which, not to nitpick here, would have been the important reasons why they came in the first place. Instead of the Hamlet quote at the opening.
Which I gotta agree with Rook here that this is so goddamn unnecessary. This would have been the top priority as to why they showed up on Mars. Instead, we're given a Hamlet quote at the very opening and dropped us off with no context clues as to why we're there in the first place. Just to save extra minutes, those two can't even exit out of the decontamination chamber except for Kenzo for whatever reason. It's as if they're expecting him and not those two.
Decontamination sequence completed.
There was something wrong about that decontamination. Something very wrong.
Not to spoil anything, but this is going to be very important later in the game.
Is anyone around? Anyone alive? Or dead? If you're dead, don't answer.
Some of the voice lines are okay, but that one that Kenzo delivered is just one of the worst. It's as if Stephen Marley just added the unnecessary into the game itself.
If anyone here was alive, would they have left the corpse lying in a corridor?
I mentioned earlier that they have like the hilarious run cycle, like they have the stiff urgency to use the bathroom. That is until you come to the inventory screen is where it becomes a big problem, which I will get there in just a minute. In the original Resident Evil, when you play as either Jill or Chris Redfield, they have a different inventory and difficulty settings that are different from each other. For example, Chris Redfield has a 6-box inventory, but in Japan, he's labeled as hard difficulty. And as for Jill Valentine, she has an 8-box inventory, but she's labeled as easy difficulty. The reasons why I brought this up is because there's a lot of friendly user interface in the inventory screen on Resident Evil versus Martian Gothic. For example, the map and file tabs. The map, however, shows you where exactly you are at all times, but also, however, shows you where some of the doors are locked that you haven't even gone through. And as for the file tabs, it keeps all the memos and records and everything else that is actually in the file tabs and not in the inventory screen.
As for Martian Gothic, as soon as you pick up a note or a recorder, it counts as an inventory item that you need to drop off somewhere. The problem is that there's no file tabs, just so you can cycle through in order to progress in the game. And as for the map, it's a shitty drawing of the base that has no clear indications where you are on the map and had to take an educated guess.
This is especially going to be a problem way later in the game. But seeing this many inventory boxes than Resident Evil makes me think that there's something wrong with this game. After Kenzo sees a dead person and makes a comment about it, which he doesn't seem surprised about, we finally get to the office and unlock the door that Martin Korn is at.
You're out of the box now, Karn, but Decontam 3 door won't respond. We'll have to find a way to unlock Decontam 3.
Now's a good time to fucking run out of this office.
Sir, can we talk about the story as we explore?
Oh fuck, you're right. The story. The reasons why these three were sent to Mars base is because Mars was out of communication for 10 months. In Resident Evil, Bravo Team was sent in order to investigate where the hideout of the group is and hasn't been reported within 24 hours, which prompted Alpha Team to come looking for them, but also investigate where this hideout of the group is.
10 days without radio communications would make sense in situations like this. But 10 months, that is goddamn ridiculous.
Resident Evil makes a hell of a lot more sense than Martian Gothic is because they were given 24 hours to just radio in, otherwise Alpha Team was going to look for them.
Corridor after corridor, and not a living soul. Shadows and echoes. This is a haunted house on Mars.
Earlier on the title card, that is not a mistypo. This is actually, of course, the very first before there was a Dead Space. You might say that the developers that made Dead Space got an inspiration from this game, but that's just a coincidence. The entire purpose of this game is to stay alone, stay alive by swapping between 3 of the characters in order to explore the entire base. We weren't given much clue as to why we have to stay alone and stay alive throughout the majority of the entire game, until it's much later revealed as to why we have to stay alone, stay alive.
After exploring the entire base, walking past dead corpses and reanimated shamblers, we uncover the purposes as to why the base is important. The base is used to terraform Mars into an Earth-like atmosphere, which explains the biodome-like park that looks outside into the dust-like canyon on Mars, trees planted into the Mars soil, water irrigation system, gardening shed, and air filtration system.
There's something in Resoc antechamber. It's big, it's mean, and you wouldn't want to share a beer with it. Know what I'm saying?
There's a file that mentions about the Mars-like bacteria, which it could explain why the zombies and whatever the hell that is in the antechamber, but it doesn't explain why it became inactive within 10 months and then became active. Let's just say I don't want to throw my chips under the assumption that it has something to do with the Mars-like bacteria. The main problem with this game is the main enemy, known as the Undead, which you can actually, of course, just shoot them to shit, but they'll only be down for only about 2 to 6 minutes before they even get back up. Going back to Resident Evil, whenever you see a zombie, you could just murder it straight up, and then you just leave the room and then come back, they're no longer there, and have to deal with it again. Same thing with the Hunter Alphas, which are no longer a problem. But with Martian Gothic, you have to run around them or possibly rationing your ammunition in order to progress somewhere within the base, which means that the enemies can't die, which is total fucking bullshit.
Martian Gothic is one of those where the fuck do I go kind of games, where it doesn't give a clear indication on what to do next. The biggest problem, aside from the enemies getting back up and attacking, is the locked doors that require color tags, especially the leveled up ones, in order to have access into those doors, but also stay alone.
Now, why does it sound similar to System Shock? As soon as you get one of the color-coded badges, you can have access to one of the medical bay throughout Citadel Station. Hell, there's even recorders and notes that are left by NPCs that tells you what to do next with the puzzles. Much in the similar contrast to System Shock. If I would have known anything else better, I say Stephen Marley got the inspiration from this game in order to make Martian Gothic. Not only Martian Gothic took inspiration from System Shock, but there's also another game that System Shock took inspiration from, Omega Virus, an electronic board game from 1992 where 4 players has to cooperate with each other in order to hunt down the virus before Earth gets destroyed within 10 to 30 minutes of gameplay. It later became the foundation for System Shock in 1994, 2 years after the board game was released. Martian Gothic was released 6 years after System Shock was released in 1994, and after their previous game, Dreamweb. So right now, I'm deeply curious as to what other releases in 1994 besides System Shock.
Target locked.
Oh, you have got to be kidding me. So let's address the pink elephant in the room, what we know so far. So not only Stephen Marley got inspirations from Resident Evil with its tank controls and its puzzle solving, as well as System Shock with its audio log, recorders, even including an AI narration, but it also borrowed several other elements from 1994. Take for example Alone in the Dark from 1992. This was the first survival horror with its tank controls and its inventory management right before Resident Evil came out in 1996. Alone in the Dark 3 in 1994 is the last entry of the Alone in the Dark series, until Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare that was supposed to rival against Resident Evil in its rise of popularity in the year 2000. What's interesting to note on is that you're still picking up paper, notes, even including notepads, which still counts as inventory item. which is why Martian Gothic has notes and recorders still count as inventory item. Looking back at Resident Evil again, as soon as you pick up a file or a book, it counts as a file item and not an inventory item, which is why there is a file tab in the inventory management. And as for System Shock, at first I thought Doom 2 Hell on Earth came out right before System Shock came out in September of 1994. However, that is not the case, as it reveals that this game came out in September versus Doom 2 came out in October 1994. However, those two games are on the same engine, but in a different plane of the existence of its technical limitations. And as for the movie Time Cop, this movie came out 7 days before System Shock came out on September 23rd. But it's also going to be important later within the game as soon as I explain about the death details. And then there's Dreamweb. Funnier note is that Martian Gothic was going to be a sequel to Dreamweb, but instead got switched from the point-and-click aspect to survival horror, just like Resident Evil, in its rise of popularity. Even though it got changed into the survival horror, its puzzles are still remain from the point-and-click to the survival horror. In other words, when it was originally from point-and-click with all its puzzles and its unnecessary clown car logic, it still exists within the survival horror when it got swapped. Hell, Stephen Marley in the interview can confirm this when the changes were made. So now that we know about Stephen Marley, how he just took inspirations from each of these elements, let's talk about Martian Gothic.
As stated before, Martian Gothic has clunky tank controls where characters have the urgency to use the bathroom when running. It gets even more redundant when items you pick up will only become useful way later in the game. Take for example the notes and audio recordings, where it becomes unnecessary at first glance, until it becomes important way later. The terminal that is in the officer's room has a voice recognition software that requires the person's voice to have access to the terminal. By using the audio recorder, you gain access to the terminal, which was a clever puzzle we first thought. That is, we came across another terminal that requires a biometric handprint to have access to the terminal. It's a rescue from earlier, but requires a hand to gain access. So what exactly to do? We found a hacksaw from earlier to gain access to the garden shed in the Arboretum Biodome. And we had to cut a hand from one of the corpses in the washroom and send it through the pneumatic tubes to Matlock. That is, until you free her from the decontamination room, she was in the entire time by finding the password to the door. Using the same terminal to unlock Khan's door in the officer's room from earlier.
It's puzzles like those two that kind of make sense in the survival horror genre. That is until, of course, we get to the unnecessary ones. For example, this little room where it's just a research room that has the statue inside, which Matlock makes a comment about it, which seems nothing out of the ordinary at first or nothing of interest until we get a warning message saying that there's a psionic activity within the room, that it just takes psionic damage towards every single last character. Which I seriously have no clue what prompted to just come and kill the characters with its psionic damage. It has something to do with the statue itself that's in the room that has like a bunch of holes that you're gonna have to plug it up, and then you have to use the resonator fork in order to make a musical sound which quiets out the psionic activity. While there's a fucking zombie in the room that you gotta have to put it down multiple times in order to actually do this puzzle. Keep this close in mind that these bastards are fucking unkillable. Yeah, sure, you could just put them down for about 6 minutes, or 4 minutes, if there is any other minutes, but they get up randomly and just come after you, making the game as a recipe for being unplayable. All I wanted to do is just solve this fucking unnecessary puzzle while this bastard keeps pestering me. Damn, just fucking get down already. Shit. There's even another unnecessary puzzle that's in a room that's completely black and white.
Now this is really weird. Total color drain. And it's full of phantoms.
You might be sitting there and thinking, what is the purpose of this entire fucking room being black and white? Well, it turns out that there's an important item inside the locker where you have to basically, of course, have to find out the color combination into numeric numbers. The purpose of that room being black and white is that the enemies, the non-dead, are colorblind. Which seems kinda stupid just to turn the entire room black and white like I'm on the set of David Lynch's next film. But it also makes me wonder, whose fucking bright idea was it just to turn the entire room into a colorblind puzzle? It could argue that this could be Stephen Marley's idea, but I like to think that it's the developers who worked on it. And unlike the previous room, you get to walk away unscathed without any adjustment to your television. With the discussion about the puzzles out of the way, let's talk about the enemies and the weapons.
As we already established, that Martian Gothic story is similar to Resident Evil, mixed with Doom being on Mars. The problem with this game is that you can't even kill enemies. Technically you can down them for about 4 to 6 minutes and that's it, which rendered the game unplayable on top of managing the ammo.
Which is one of the reasons why the game is so goddamn difficult, mainly due to the programmers' blunders. Take for example Resident Evil. You're only given 2 options, run and avoid them or just shoot them and they're dead. And once you do kill them and then you come back to the same room, you don't have to worry about that same zombie 4 to 6 minutes every single goddamn time. Unlike Martian Gothic, where you have to constantly go through corridors, have to worry about the same fucking zombies every 4 to 6 minutes as soon as they get up. Not your average Thursday afternoon just to play this game where it's fucking unplayable, now is it?
So let's look at the 3 enemies that are in the game. The non-dead, the most common enemy, resembling zombies or reanimated corpses. They are immortal and will eventually rise again, with faster reanimation times as the game progresses.
These guys are like the biggest fuck you moment in video game history. Why put an enemy that you can't even possibly kill throughout the majority of this entire game is beyond me. Oh, remember the statue room puzzle from earlier? Imagine solving a puzzle while a dead guy is just getting up 3 or 4 times. That's not a gameplay feature, that is a fuck all annoyance.
Trimorphs are grotesque, dangerous creatures composed of 3 merged human bodies. They are mostly invulnerable to conventional weapons and often need to be avoided.
When I first saw these ugly bastards, they kind of remind me of the necromorphs from Dead Space series. In fact, upon looking at them, they kind of look like the predatory type thing that would be in John Carpenter's The Thing. Let me just kill you the suspense of all of this. See, as soon as you just bring power to mood and then you go into virtual reality just to raise all bulkheads through the virtual of that reality, which you might think may cause a problem, but here goes. After that whole stay alone, stay alive, you would think you could just regroup, right? Well, not exactly. As soon as one of the other characters come near one of the others, well, this happens. I seriously have no fucking clue what just happened. So let me just unpack here just to explain what is happening in this shot and this shot alone. I sent Medlock to meet Kenzo in the virtual room, and then all of a sudden, all 3 characters are in the same room, they're freaking out, and then all of a sudden, there's a trimorph. I guess what happened is that all 3 of them are at the proximity, and that's why it created a trimorph? Sort of like this one from Time Cop. Now why the fuck we couldn't see an animation budget for this one? This animation right here would have made a hell of a lot more sense than just still images. Like what happened? Did the game programmers didn't have time to just put that in there? Or was it the fact that the game programmers just snuck it in there without Stephen Marley knowing it, before it's already too late when the game was shipped? You might be sitting there and wondering what caused them to turn into the trimorph. Well, it's mainly due to the decontamination spray room. Yeah, remember how Kenzo was talking about how the decontamination felt off? Well, that's where the bacteria is coming from. Now, how in the living fuck did the bacteria ended up in the decontamination spray is way beyond me. Even though that we have the mission objective to find an escape route and blow the base up, Now it gives us with another mission objective just to find the cure. Only this one is going to be more complicated because it requires all the other DNAs in order to actually make the cure. Dr. John Farr, which happens to be this gentleman behind the counter, listed the list of DNAs that needed to be extracted. The 3 human hosts, the Trimorph, and the alien queen.
Now it might seem simple enough for Summer and us because the 3 have the DNA they hold, but the other 2 is far fucking complicated. The Trimorph DNA doesn't appear until you kill one at the entrance of the escape pod with a flare gun. The flare gun in question is in the air locker where the Trimorph was ejected. Problem is that it doesn't appear after that thing was ejected. The developers who worked on this didn't know the concept of keeping weapons in storage and not the enemies, which made the game bullshit. Okay, we understand about killing one in order to get the DNA for the cure, but there's multiple Trimorphs that are lettered in the base that we could kill. Yet none of them holds the DNA unlike the one in the entrance of the escape pod, which again is total bullshit.
You cannot be serious!
The developers who worked on this doesn't want to give any players the easy route of the easy win of just getting this DNA fast-paced start. Instead, it's just the one that is actually in the air locker, which is in the tunnel that leads into the escape pod. The last DNA, which I will get there in just a moment, but now we need to focus on the last enemy.
Extrudes, spider-looking, venomous creatures that can move throughout the entire room, often leaping to attack.
They're like the hands that just came off of the Trimorph that's just crawling around on all 4s, just in this hallway or the next hallway. They're like the spider head crab that is in the movie John Carpenter's The Thing.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
Man, I love that movie. Now, movie critics nowadays don't even know what good special effects is nowadays. Now, about the last DNA, which is the Martian Queen. Well, the Martian Queen is only located in the one last location, which is of course Necropolis, an underground tunnel that looks a bit cathedral-like. So not only Mars Vita Base has a base where they can actually conduct an experiment of just terraforming Mars, they now have an archaeological dig that is directly below them. The strange thing about the cavern is that it has some oxygen, mainly due to molten and ice. Plus, it actually sheds some light as to what is happening on Mars base, mainly because they discovered Mars-like bacteria that is actually in the cavern, but they also, however, discovered the Martian Queen in its sarcophagus, and they were planning to use her or whatever else that's in the cavern as a psionic weapon. Which it does explain why there's 3 different enemy types, as well as some strange occurrences within Mars base. Trouble is that this game didn't even execute it properly, mainly due to the puzzles that they were shoehorned in by the developers. In an interview, Stephen Marley pointed out that there was an in-house drama between him, the developers, even the publisher who interfered with this project. To summarize from this whole entire experience, Stephen Marley was the art director that made Martian Gothic, yet the developers and the publishers, I feel, were fucking with him and undermined his decision when everything else was changed, from point and click to survival horror, along with the puzzles that are actually shoehorned in. The developers who worked on Martian Gothic were pretty much extensively new to this whole 3-dimensional database, rather than the 2-dimensional database they're familiar with, such as like Dreamweb. However, the publisher that were involved may have something to do with its slight changes, and not to mention, of course, the unnecessary of its interference of how this game would have been perfect if it wasn't for the publisher's interference. For example, the combat system. You got your standard pistols, submachine gun, flare gun, which is only used for the Trimorphs that you could just literally kill them with. And then, of course, the Sayonara, which is a psionic weapon that only uses on ghosts. Like, non-dead version of ghosts. However, using one of the weapons and then targeting an enemy, such as like this one, for example, it doesn't have the lock on target, or the auto-aim, as more familiar with Resident Evil. It seems like the developers who were pretty much new to this whole 3-dimensional database
didn't seem to program this whole auto-aim. And the publishers, who actually, of course, demanded this game, to be created and not to mention, of course, shipped out through the door, basically, of course, didn't give much of a thought about the combat system. The pistol and the submachine gun that is used to kill enemies, however, only puts them down for about 4 to 6 minutes. This is not a gameplay feature. They just didn't even program them to be killed off or perhaps been eliminated throughout the board. I mean, you got this potential cosmic body horror type of survival horror game that Stephen Marley was just going for, which I could definitely see where he was actually going with this art direction. Yet it was interfered with both the game developers, who are relatively new to the three-dimensional database, but you also, however, have publishers who are driven by greed and possibly wanted this game out the door as possible. Looking back at Resident Evil, the reasons why it's so simpler and such a classic is because it has that auto-aim, but it also, however, has like simple puzzles. Not to mention, of course, the tank controls are absolutely 100% functional, rather than, of course, Martian Gothic that has that clunky tank controls.
What I'm saying is that if this was handed over to Capcom as a freelance job or a consulting job, then this game would have been just a hidden gem in the PlayStation or PC library. But no, instead, it was publishers' interference and game developers who are new to this three-dimensional database that crippled it.
The story in question is trying to be a cosmic body horror survival horror game,
as we already established.
Yet the story is not the cleanest. Seriously, it's a copy-paste of Resident Evil, only it's on Mars.
Which genuinely doesn't surprise me, considering Stephen Marley did play Resident Evil before coming up with this idea.
Mars base was used to terraform Mars into an Earth-like atmosphere, yet they are hiding two things: the archaeological dig site, and the potential psionic weapon from both Mars bacteria and the Mars Queen.
And this is how we know this is a straight-up copy of Resident Evil, but only in Mars. The whole purpose of Resident Evil is that Umbrella Corporation is just a pharmaceutical company, but underneath it, they were making biological weapons. But in Martian Gothic, Ground Control wanted to have an inhabitable of just making Mars being terraformed into an Earth-like atmosphere, but underneath it, they were looking through the archaeological dig and also the potential of the psionic weapon.
For the purpose of eliminating the resistance, which sounds like a plot to the new Wolfenstein game.
Which it kinda does sound like a plot for Wolfenstein or Doom if you say it in a sentence like that. Only problem is that this ain't a first-person shooter, but rather a survival horror game that got evolved from a point-and-click originally into this tank-controlled mess. The final area is the necropolis, or the archaeological dig site, where you need to find the queen in order to obtain the final DNA. Trouble is that it has some complicated matters, which I can't even possibly explain, in order to finally obtain the final DNA in order to make the cure. Once you finally do make the cure, you gotta have to figure out a way how to blow up the base and also make your escape.
Here goes. Time to run. Hey, are we cured?
Looks like it. We're standing right beside each other and nothing's happening.
Good work, Matlock. You too, Kenzo. Let's get the hell out of here.
Commencing launch sequence. Primary ignition sequence engaged. Polarized oscillators in post-fibrillation.
Hello, I'm overriding this paltry onboard computer to deliver a rather important message. Within a minute, this entire craft will be overwhelmed by molten lava. And more bad news, the shuttle bay roof hatch has become disconnected from the infomesh system and can be opened by manual means only. I've just released the manual override lever in the bay. One of you will have to run terribly fast and throw the lever up. If you're very quick, you might just make it back before the shuttle takes off.
You have got to be kidding me. So in conclusion, Martian Gothic, however, has this potential, has this opportunity, but it failed miserably, mainly due to two things. The game developers who are being new at this three-dimensional database, as well as the publisher who are interfering with this entire game. So, with that being said, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.
And it's time to say goodbye to all of you. But I'll be seeing you again very soon. Goodbye.